On a remote island, a squad of American soldiers washes ashore. One soldier dies instantly, while 3 others move inland, hoping to find help. But Leroy chooses a different path. He is convinced that Japanese forces control the area. He's right. Pushing through the jungle, Leroy spots his comrades being captured. Powerless, he watches as they're forced to dig their own graves and executed on spot. With no choice, he disappears deeper into the wilderness. This is the story of a man who became a legend. Farewell to the king. Fast forward 3 years to February 1945. British officer Captain Fairborn and his radio man Tenga parachute into Borneo. Their mission is to unite local forces and build resistance against the Japanese occupation. Not long after landing, they're discovered by the Dayak tribe. Despite the cultural divide, the tribe takes them in for the night. The next morning, the two Brits wake up tied inside a longhouse. Villagers surround them, watching with suspicion and caution. Then their so-called king steps forward, only to reveal himself as Leroy, the missing American soldier. Later that night, Leroy pays them a visit. Fairborn and Tenga explain who they are and what they're doing here. Their goal is to unite the tribes, fight back, and bring Leroy into the fold as a resistance leader. But Leroy isn't convinced that he's not eager to drag his people into someone else's war. He walks away, offering no clear answer. Soon after, Leroy calls a tribal gathering. Fairborn and Tenga are invited to observe. There, Leroy opens up that he recounts his story of survival after fleeing the Japanese. He wandered aimlessly for weeks, starving, covered in leeches, on the brink of death, until a man named Gwei found him. Gwei took him to a hidden village, but a man named Liang planned to trade Leroy's head for a reward. Before that could happen, Gwei's sister stepped in. The tribe saw Leroy's blue eyes and strange tattoo as divine signs. To them, he wasn't a man. He was a messenger, maybe even a god. Over time, Leroy became one with the Dayak tribe. He spoke their language, followed their customs, and hunted as if he was born in the jungle. Bit by bit, he stopped being an outsider. Then one day, he confronted Liang, and in a brutal one-on-one fight, Leroy came out on top. He spared Liang, but made sure the message was clear. From that point on, Leroy stepped into a leadership role. He spoke to the tribe, and his words carried weight. Inspired by his vision, the Dayak united. 22 longhouses pledged allegiance. Leroy was crowned king, and in a grand tribal ceremony, he married Gwei's sister. For the first time in years, he found peace. But Captain Fairborn returned with a proposal. The Allies were planning a major offensive, and they needed Leroy to rally the Dayak into the fight, but Leroy refused. He wasn't going to risk his people for someone else's war. Then, a Japanese fighter plane roared overhead and opened fire on the village. The surprise attack left devastation behind. Leroy was furious. He blamed Fairborn, convinced the Allied presence had put a target on their backs. Fairborn tried to reason with him. The war wasn't waiting for permission anymore. It was already here. Everyone had to choose a side, fight back or fall. After a tense pause, Leroy agreed to lead the resistance. But he laid down one non-negotiable demand. The Allies must give his people written promises of protection, along with proper weapons to defend themselves. Fairborn agreed. Not long after, 4 American soldiers arrived to support the operation: Captain Conklin, Armstrong, Dave, and Statch. They wasted no time. The villagers were trained in everything from automatic rifles to guerrilla tactics. The transformation was fast. The Dayak were no longer just forest hunters. They became a fighting force. As their strength grew, so did their unity. They were ready to fight for their land. Soon, the joint forces launched their first operation by mapping Japanese positions. While crossing a river, the team spread out. That's when Fairborn spotted a group of enemy soldiers and moved in to take photos, but he got too close and was spotted. Gunfire erupted, and the mission turned into chaos. They returned fire and managed to escape, scattered and running for cover, but alive. Later on, Captain Conklin located Leroy and urged him to evacuate, but Leroy refused to leave. Fairborn was still missing, sick with malaria, and Leroy wasn't going to abandon him. Without hesitation, Leroy went searching. Meanwhile, Fairborn, barely conscious, struggled through the jungle until he collapsed. Leroy found him just in time and tried to get him out. But before they could move far, Japanese soldiers closed in and opened fire. Wounded and exhausted, Leroy carried Fairborn through the crossfire and got them both to safety. 3 days passed before Fairborn finally came to. Thanks to the tribe's care, his condition improved. In return, he made a solemn vow that he'd return to Allied headquarters and bring back the promised agreement, written proof of protection and weapons for the Dayak people. The next day, Fairborn flew to Morotai, the Central Allied base in the Maluku Islands. He brought Leroy's demand straight to his commanding officers, but the answer was a firm no. The brass ordered him to drop the deal and ignore the tribe's needs. Fairborn wasn't having it. He pushed for a meeting with General MacArthur himself, and it paid off. After hearing the situation firsthand, MacArthur approved the request and signed the agreement. With the document in hand, Fairborn returned to Borneo. Back in the jungle, the Dayak welcomed him like a hero. The official Allied document was in hand, and the promise was finally real. That night, Leroy met with Fairborn and thanked him for honoring the deal and standing up for the tribe. The next morning, Leroy brought Fairborn to a hidden place, the home of the Punan Dayak, an isolated tribe untouched by the outside world. The only way in or out was through a narrow cave passage. Knowing the Japanese were closing in, Leroy had a plan. He wanted the passage rigged with explosives. If things got bad, they'd blow it to protect the tribe. Later that day, Leroy led a surprise strike on the Japanese. Now armed with Allied weapons, the Dayak forces destroyed a key bridge and ambushed a convoy. The sudden attack shattered enemy lines and forced the Japanese into retreat. That night, Leroy and Fairborn regrouped to plan what could be their final stand. With their full team assembled, they headed back toward the war zone, but the situation on the ground had deteriorated fast. Villages were overcrowded with refugees, homes were gone, and food was running out. Realizing the Japanese troops were weak from starvation, Leroy ordered the Dayak to strike hard. They destroyed supply routes, cut off access points, and launched hit-and-run attacks to keep the enemy from pushing further inland. As the Japanese grew more desperate, their attacks turned savage. The Longhouse, symbol of Dayak unity, became a key target. Then came even worse news. Gwei reported an entire village had vanished. When they arrived, they found only bones. The villagers had been slaughtered and eaten by the Japanese in a final act of survival. That same night, they staged an ambush near the rice fields. Heavy rain and darkness made visibility nearly impossible, so they lit a fire for light. The enemy struck hard, and a brutal firefight erupted. Both sides took heavy losses. 2 American soldiers, Armstrong and Statch, were killed in the clash. By morning, Leroy got word that the Japanese were heading toward Cloud Gap, planning to destroy the hidden cave that protected the Punan tribe. Leroy and his team raced to intercept, but the enemy was already there and waiting. The mission failed, so they were forced to retreat. Back at the village, alarms were raised. Traditional drums echoed across the hills. Danger was near. The Japanese had breached their defenses. Women, including Joy, armed themselves and joined the front line. They fought back fiercely, but the line couldn't hold. Half the villagers were killed. On the way back, Fairborn and Leroy saw the carnage firsthand. Bodies lay across scorched ground, buildings reduced to rubble. Mortars had been used, but the Japanese pulled back before they could be eliminated. Leroy sprinted to his home. What he found was total destruction. Everything was gone. Afterward, he gathered the survivors. Alongside his adopted son, Leroy set fire to the village. They would leave nothing behind for the enemy to use. From this point forward, there was only one goal: to strike back hard. Fairborn had arranged an airstrike, but for Leroy, that wasn't enough. Bombs alone wouldn't satisfy the dead. He wanted justice the old way, blood for blood. Meanwhile, near the waterfall, the last group of Japanese soldiers heard ritual chanting echoing through the trees. It was clear that they had been found. Panicked, they tried to flee, but it was too late. Every path was cut off. The Allied forces, together with the Dayak warriors and villagers, launched a full-scale assault. The enemy was wiped out. The war ended right there at the base of the waterfall in a decisive victory. The aftermath was grim. The ground soaked with blood, the bodies of Japanese soldiers scattered everywhere. Leroy had fought with his own hands, but even with the enemy defeated, the damage to his village and family was irreversible. Then on August 6, 1945, Leroy made a vow never to surrender. Moments later, a radio broadcast confirmed what many had hoped for. America had dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. The end of the war seemed near, but not yet. Before Japan officially surrendered, another attack hit the village. Amid the chaos, Fairborn tried to flee, but a Japanese soldier struck him with a bayonet. He collapsed and vanished in a melee. As night fell, Leroy also disappeared. No one saw him again after the final attack. He was gone without a trace. 3 weeks later, Fairborn awoke in a military hospital in Brunei. Wounded, but alive, his fiancée brought the news that Japan had finally surrendered. The war was over. Elsewhere, Leroy had also survived. He negotiated directly with the remaining Japanese officers and secured an unconditional surrender. Their captain handed over his sword in defeat. But this time, the threat came from the Allies. Fairborn's superiors began planning a quiet takeover of the Dayak kingdom, not by war, but by controlling food and supplies. To avoid another conflict, Fairborn made a hard call. He gave them the location of the salt routes, which are the Dayak's lifeline. The next day, Allied troops blocked the path. Leroy arrived with his men to collect supplies. A standoff followed. Leroy tried to talk, but the terms were clear: surrender or starve. Left with no option, Leroy gave in. He surrendered peacefully to protect his people. Despite all he had done, Leroy was branded a traitor. He was arrested, separated from his adopted son, and treated as a criminal. When the Allied soldiers came to take him, they beat him in front of the villagers. Leroy didn't resist. He was placed on a military transport ship bound for detention. But as the ship sailed through the Malacca Strait, a powerful storm struck. In the chaos, Fairborn saw an opportunity. He took the risk and helped Leroy escape. The end. So the moral of the story is, if you survive leeches, war, betrayal, and a jungle wedding, you still might get arrested by your own team. So maybe don't get too comfortable being a jungle king.